Let's start with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we are so grateful for who you are, and we hope that we can learn a little bit more about you today, a little bit about who you are and how you're trying to guide us to an understanding of who you are. Please let your voice come through. In Jesus' name, amen. I should not be surprised, I suppose. When I arrived here, I don't think I got more than 50 feet into the camp, and somebody who either knew my grandfather or knew my father or knew me managed to find me, and everybody back here is waiting for me to show up and come in and say, get started. And that's kind of the cool thing about our church. There's some special things about that connection that exists. So that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to talk a little bit about what we have before us. So as they mentioned, my name is Shad Lehman. I'm the Director of Education for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Canada, which is based in Oshawa. So greetings from everybody there. And you would probably assume that if I'm here in that capacity, then I'm going to talk about education, and if that's the case, you wouldn't be wrong. Now, I could spend the rest of our time between now and lunch trying to explain all the virtues of the Seventh-day Adventist Church's educational system, all the great things about it and all that, but I'm not going to do that today because that's not necessary. Instead, I want to talk a little bit about why it's so important, but from a different perspective than maybe what you would expect. My brother-in-law, him and his wife actually just moved here from New Zealand. And while he was in New Zealand, that's where he grew up. And so they were over there for the last several years, and he was working at a place called Outward Bound, where people come out for various reasons just to try to maybe reconnect with nature, reconnect with themselves, reconnect with who knows what, in an outdoor setting. But also there's a lot of adventure that's involved with that. And so my brother-in-law really likes things like whitewater kayaking, rock climbing, going on long hikes and treks. Now, for anybody who maybe knows who my father is, Paul Lehman, he taught similar types of things at Burman University for 43 years. He was taught in the Hour Pursuits department. And there he would teach things like ice climbing and rock climbing. We can do ice climbing here in Canada. It's a little harder in some areas of New Zealand, but some places it's done a lot. And so as my family was making our way out to British Columbia for camp meeting here, we stopped in Rocky Mountain House to visit with my brother and sister-in-law, and also to pick up my sister-in-law and her kids and bring them out so they could see Grandpa and Grandma, because my wife's family all lives out in the Lower Mainland. So we stopped there, we spent a little bit of time, and my brother-in-law and I said, you know what, it's a good opportunity, let's get out and let's go do some rock climbing. So we wanted to find something that is considered multi-pitch, and that's where you have to climb up from the base of a cliff up to a section, and then you tie in there, and then you have to do another pitch. So a pitch is a length of rope, and you just keep working your way up. Now, just so you're aware, what we were climbing was nothing that terribly complicated, and we were completely tied in. We were completely safe. In fact, those ropes and things that we tie into, in many cases, would have the ability to pull a car out of a ditch. So there's no real concern about a safety component unless there's human error involved. But with that being said, where we were climbing was a place near Nordegg called Abraham Lake. There's the Abraham Slide. I see somebody nodding their head already, because I think Croy's done some climbing in that same area. And we climbed up this 4-pitch climb, and we're right at the top, and we're looking down, and right below us is Abraham Lake. That's on the North Saskatchewan, it was created by the North Saskatchewan River because they dammed it off in order to hopefully create not only power, but a place where people could spend time enjoying watercraft and things like that. Turned out the water was too cold, and it's always windy, so you can't really do anything. But when you stand at the top of this cliff and you're looking out over all the mountains and this enormous lake, you see this beautiful, pristine, crystal clear lake. And then if you go to Edmonton, you're like, what happened to the water? Because it's no longer nice and green, it's just kind of yucky and brown. And you get out to Saskatchewan, it's even yuckier and browner. And you wonder what's taking place. And sometimes I look at our world, and maybe some of you have thought the same thing. It's like things aren't pristine the way they were at the beginning of the Bible. It's like this river slowly kind of collecting things. And so that's what I want to focus on, that perspective of education, the value that comes from education in God's way, because there's something about it that is different than what a lot of us would expect. Now, I could go on and I could share some of the fun jokes that we have out there about education, and I'm going to have to start walking around because I am an educator, and teachers don't stay in one spot very long. And standing there is just uncomfortable. So you may see me move a little bit. What are some of the running jokes? When I was, 15, 16, 17, 18, going through high school, getting ready to go to college, the running joke was, you go to Berman University to find a spouse. I mean, it's not about the education. You're going to come away married. And there was always, there's always been kind of a negative connotation with that. And I think about it, and I'm like, well, there could be. But then I'm like, I met my wife at Berman University, and it was the best thing that happened to me. Why is that a negative thing? We have these funny jokes about that. But really, what is the point of education? It's not about going to Berman to get married. It's not about being in a school system that's going to train you. We say we want something that's going to, Ellen White has even said, train us for this earth and the earth to come. But what does that all mean? So our scripture reading came from Deuteronomy. We've heard this many times before. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. You shall build them upon a sign on your heart, and they shall be as the frontlets behind your eyes. You shall write them on your doorpost of your house and on your gates. I find that interesting. That is in reference to the commands that God had just given Israel. So the question is, why? Was God coming along and saying, these commands are so important that I'm going to set them here, and if you do not follow them, salvation is impossible? I've met people who might think that way. I'm going to argue a little bit differently, though. Not that I don't think that the commands aren't important. In fact, I do think that God's commands are highly important. In fact, I think they're so important, that's why God put it the way he did here, that it's going to be something that you're teaching and you're doing all the time. And he put them there and made it that important because those commands are a reflection of God's character. And to me, that becomes the importance of education. Now, education, as I see it, is something that was instituted at the very beginning in Eden. Now, it doesn't seem to explicitly say that in the Bible. We've said, as Adventists, we often say there's a lot of different things that we explicitly think were instituted by Christ right at the beginning, right in Eden. Things like marriage, things like that. Education doesn't seem to be explicit, but I'll share a couple arguments why I feel that may be the case. Now I've got these guys with the cameras working. I can see them trying to keep up with me as I walk around. This is just for practice in case you end up going to a golf tournament and you have to follow one of those little golf balls. So in Eden, there's an example and an idea that instruction is being given, right? In Genesis 2, verses 15 and 16, we see the idea that God says to Adam, take a look at everything that's out here in front of you. You can eat from any tree in this garden, except one. Now, to me, that is instruction being given. There's an instruction being given, but it's not just a command of instruction. There's an instruction being given that's sharing this idea that I want to teach you something. I want to share with you and teach you something. But we see that the fact that there is this tree of the knowledge of good and evil that they aren't to eat from, that also tells me that there is a counter educational system that is already in existence within God's universe. We see that as you continue to read through the Bible, of course, through explanations about Lucifer in places like Ezekiel. So there's instruction given. Another thing that's very important with instruction is experience. So in the educational world, experiential education is king. In fact, they've done research to determine what are the best ways to get information across to people. And they say if you instruct it the way I am to you right now, which is kind of the boring way, just standing here and lecturing. So here I am breaking my own rules. The retention rate can be 25%. Somebody watches it kind of in a more informative television show type thing, it's still around 25%. If somebody reads it, the ability to retain is about 50%. If somebody experiences it, the rate of being able to remember, retain, and do what they need to do through an experiential experience is 95% or higher. And so God knows this, and I find another interesting piece where I think this shows that an educational system is being instituted in Eden from the very beginning. And that is, after he creates Adam, if you read the Bible in the chronological order, then he takes Adam out and he says, take a look at everything I created to you, and all these animals that are here, I want you to name them. Make them yours. They're part of this world I'm giving you. You get to name the animals. So Adam's sitting there and he's going through, and any kids that are listening, I can imagine they've probably got a million ideas as to what they would have named the animals. Right? And that's what Adam got to do. We get to like my age and older, and all of a sudden our imagination quits working, and we're like, I don't know. I guess it's just what it is. But Adam would have been just like a child. He would have been enthralled with all these things, and he would have come up with these names that we don't know what they would have been like, but they would have been amazing. And as he's going through and looking at all of this, he's looking around, and he's thinking, boy, there is nothing here that's like me. Right? I mean, that giraffe over there matches that giraffe over there. That was a fun one to name. And that little frog on the tree matches that other frog over there. But there's nothing like me. And I actually believe that God was educating Adam at that point. That was all part of, I'm giving you something really amazing, but you need to learn some things as you go along. And so Adam recognizes this, and then God creates Eve. And I believe that was because Adam needed to recognize, he needed to learn something. And those things that he learned was, I need a companion here with me. And I need to realize and recognize the creative power of God to create a companion that is so perfect for me. And also from him as well, which is really neat. But immediately this counter-educational system comes into play, right? It isn't very long after that we see the ideas of doubt, self, personal attainment, and desire being presented in the story of Eden as Eve confronts Satan in the tree. And he's trying to create and present a counter-educational experience to Eve that presents something different, that says, but this is what you need to learn. This is what you need to know. These are the things you need. You need to understand the difference between good and evil. Why would God want to withhold this from you? And as soon as we have a counter-educational system put in place by a being that is significantly smarter than we are, we ran into some trouble. So now God has a situation to deal with. I heard one pastor say it this way, which I thought was really interesting. You start at the beginning of the Bible, and it's perfection. You flip to the end of the Bible, it's perfection. Everything in the middle is God trying is maybe not the right word, but God navigating the sin problem of the world. Because God did not create sin. And he's trying to find a way to navigate that, not for his, if God has every ability to navigate whatever he needs to, but he needs to navigate it for our purpose, because he wants to save us. And so he institutes his education system, and he starts to say, okay, Adam, I need to train you on some things. First of all, I want to teach you about love. You understood love because I created you, but now I need to help you understand what love really is, because eventually, through the promise I'm giving here, I'm going to show you that God, myself, am going to come to earth as a man to save you. I need to show you that I'm going to have a covenant with you that I'm going to fulfill for you. And interestingly, he starts instituting that idea because not only does he do that, he creates coverings for Adam and Eve, who before this time did not realize that they were naked. Now, that statement seems funny to me until you put it into the whole expanse of the story, and you realize that it's not just that word like, oh, they were walking around without clothes on, so they didn't realize it. It's the idea that there was nothing that they had to fear, nothing they had to worry about, nothing that was getting in the way of their relationship with God. And now there was, because immediately upon sinning, they realized there was a problem. And God makes a covering for them out of lamb skin. In other words, Christ as the lamb covers their shame. And he says, I'm going to do this for you, and gives them an example right at the beginning. And we're going to see that carry through a little bit further as we go along. Now, as I was researching and reading about this and doing this, we could go into so much depth here. I could keep you here until well after lunchtime, but I'm not going to do that. Because there's people to see out there that you have to go visit with. And that's one of the most important things about camp meeting. So I won't keep us longer than we need to. However, let's take a look at some other things that are instituted as we see education becoming an important theme that is being drawn out further and further and further as God is moving along. In Genesis 6 to 9, that whole section of Genesis, that's the flood story. And we have Noah show up in this story. Now it's interesting to me because when you read the Bible, you get this creation piece, then you get the flood piece, and it feels like all this information would have been really great if that could have been expanded on a little bit. What happened in there? There's so much there. For somebody like me who likes history and stories, I sure would have liked to have known a lot more. But he doesn't, because he's kind of racing through to get to Abraham, and that's where we're going to spend a fair bit of time today. But in Noah, he still needs to do something. God needs to show and educate the world about who he is. And this is really, really important. And this is important because now I'm going to start drawing the comparisons between what we see in the Bible and why our Seventh-day Adventist system of education exists. Because Maybe I will share this. Sometimes I wonder if I should say this or not, but I'm going to say it anyway. I have lots of opportunities to share about the Seventh-day Adventist education system in Canada. That just kind of comes with the territory. And it's very rare that I don't finish a talk that somebody comes up to me and tells me a long list of problems with our system. And if you want to do that, I mean, go for it. But just so that you know, I'm quite aware of them. We are not a perfect system because we're a system that's being run by people. But just read the book of Acts. Like, not a perfect system. There was a whole bunch of people. There was conflict all over in Acts. But they just kept going back to God, and that's our system. The Adventist education system has that as the place they're going to keep going to, even though we're imperfect people who make mistakes, who have problems. But here's something interesting. When God finds Noah, can you imagine being... I'm going to have to do the teacher thing. You guys are going to have to be like students a little bit here. I'm going to have to get your imaginations going, so I'm sorry if that's difficult, because it's harder for me at this age than it was when I was this big, so I might be stretching you a little bit, but I'm going to do it anyway. Could you imagine being Noah, and you're looking at a world around you that's completely falling apart? Does this sound familiar at all? Sounds familiar to me. I don't know if there's a time in history where you could say Christians, Muslims, atheists, you name whatever belief system you want, where everybody's speaking the same language, and that is, it looks like the world's really coming to an end here. Whether it's going to be an asteroid, a meteor, climate change, apocalyptic visions, wars, like everybody kind of has, we have a doomsday clock that scientists have created that they keep moving closer and closer to the midnight hour. The whole world is recognizing a problem. And Noah's looking out at this world that is in an awful situation, and God comes to him and says, I want you to build an ark. It's going to take you a while. It's going to take about 120 years. Now, I guess for Noah, who lived to be quite old comparatively to us, 120 years for no problem. I can bang away at nails for 120 years. Like, for me, I'd be like, I'm not going to make that. That's not going to work, God. I don't know too many people that make that age. But not only that, you're going to preach to the people. There's something very important to understand here about God's education system. Before any judgment or destruction takes place, he educates. And people have the right to believe the education or not, or to take in the education, or to go and be educated. But he educates first, because if he didn't, that wouldn't be fair. He wants people to have the opportunity to hear who he is. So he educates the people. Noah preaches to people because his true character must be presented. That's what our education system is all about. The Adventist Church was not called to create an education system. I hope nobody's here from Loma Linda. I might offend someone. I don't think so. But it didn't create an education system to create people who were going to become super wealthy doctors just doing their own thing, or to create an education system that was going to funnel a bunch of children through so that they would be successful in this world and have a lot of cash. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't benefits that come from that, because I know some of the most lovely doctors and people who've done very well, so I'm not picking on people, who have given so much back to the Adventist Church for missions because of what God has blessed them through their ability to be educated. So don't connect the two in being one's bad for the other. But that wasn't the purpose of the education system that God started with at the beginning of the Bible. The purpose of his education system from the very beginning was because he wanted to have an opportunity to show people who he is. That he instituted at Eden. The whole intent was for Adam to spend every day with God, Adam and Eve, to spend every day with God learning more and more about who He is. The benefits that come from that, by having people who become exceptional doctors and build places like Loma Linda, or people who have an opportunity to be lawyers and work for the rights of individuals with freedom of religion and things like those are all benefits that come out of having that relationship and understanding of the character of who God is. So they go very hand in hand, but we need to make sure we have the priorities in the right order. So now here's where education really starts to show through. Abraham. Abraham has an unbelievably experiential education experience. Experiential education experience? That's too many experiences in the same sentence for those of you who might be English teachers out here. He says that God comes to him and he says, I want you to leave your land and go to another land. Now that is really fascinating to me. Leave your land and go to another land that I'm promising you. I recently was looking at some statistics about the differences between various denominational groups, including the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, and non-religious affiliations, like organizations where people are somewhat tied to them, and taking an interesting comparison between what families like that look like in various groups. And for the most part, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was actually very, very unique. It was more common for Seventh-day Adventist young people to be off somewhere else other than where they grew up doing work and employment, which I found very fascinating. And then I thought, well, why would that be? Because it's not uncommon for our young people to go to one of our schools, which means leaving home. And it's not very uncommon for them to go, I've been called to a ministry somewhere. It could be overseas or it could be elsewhere. I grew up at Berman University because my dad taught there for 43 years. That was home. That was my stomping grounds. Anytime I'm there, I could close my eyes and walk around that campus. I know that place like the back of my hand, except for the new buildings they keep building to screw me up on that. But I know that place really, really well. Now, of course, my parents would love it if all their kids lived close by, but it's very interesting because I've lived in northern British Columbia teaching in Hazelton. I've taught in the Lacombe area, both in Red Deer and in the Ponoka area. I was in the Manitoba-Saskatchewan Conference. I've been out in Oshawa. All these places, because God's called me to these places, and my parents, as much as they'd like us to be near them, have always been, no, but that's where he's being called. He needs to work where God's calling him, and that's a different perspective. So God calls Abraham out of the country, not just because he needs to do things like that, but also because sometimes calling out of the country, calling somebody out of the place that they're used to, the place that is what they've always known, makes it very hard to change. But when God takes Abraham and moves him over here, now Abraham is in a position to listen because he doesn't have the distractions that are going on elsewhere. Now it's interesting that God makes a covenant with Abraham. And I want you to understand this. This was interesting to me. It wasn't that long ago that I realized this. And I'm assuming everybody here probably picked it up a lot sooner than I did in life. But this was interesting to me. God makes a covenant with Abraham, and he counts it to Abraham because all that Abraham had to do was believe. That was his job in the covenant. Believe. God does the rest. And that's really fascinating to me because I've heard people say to me, I've made a covenant with God. And as soon as you make a covenant with God, then you're the one that's doing something. Now, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be working for God and doing things for God, but that also leads to the very strong ability to have, or possibility to have, legalism. Because you're trying to fulfill something. And God didn't want Abraham to be in a legalistic situation where he was trying to do to meet God's criteria. He wanted to be able to show that he's the one that does the work. And so as soon as Abraham believed, God says, we're going to do this thing. And it's fascinating to me because as he moves through, he's taking Abraham on a journey, and Abraham, to believe, it's not like believing is an easy thing. Because many of you might think, well, that seems really easy. I guess we just believe. There is no point in the Bible where believing is made to be just an easy, simple thing to do, because for Abraham to believe, that meant he had to believe that God was telling him, you're going to have a whole country, a whole people are going to come out of you in 400 years. That's a tough thing to say, well, I'm just going to believe, right? That's different than just going, I believe, and it's done. There's a faith component in there. Abraham says, in 400 years, this is going to happen, and I'll believe that. But it's also interesting to note that part of the reason that didn't happen immediately is because the land that was being promised to him was full of a bunch of people. The Amorites and the Amalekites and all these different people. And it says, you don't get the land yet because their sins are not yet complete. We're back to why our education system exists, in my opinion on this. Because to me, I look at the story of Israel, and if you follow it through to them getting to the promised land, it very much mimics our situation as we're waiting to get to the promised land, a new earth. And how many times have you had conversations with people, or perhaps in your own mind, I know I have, saying, why haven't you come yet, Jesus? We're waiting for you. Why haven't you come? And he's saying, because the sins of the Amalekites and the Amorites are not yet complete. In other words, what he's saying is there are still people there that can be saved. And there's going to be a process because many are going to reject, and that means the fulfillment of sin being completely shown as what it is. But within this, he's building out this idea that there are people that still need to be saved, and that is why it hasn't happened. Our education system exists for that purpose. That's a part of it. We're trying to, like Noah, present something to allow people to go, I want to know who that God is. That's different than anything I've ever seen. So then we look at another situation, and that's Joseph. Now, Joseph's another story. I want you to imagine with me being Joseph. I don't know if any of you have ever taken a lot of time to look at the story of Joseph. It seems to me, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm okay with that, but it seems to me that perhaps Joseph might not have been always the most popular because he didn't necessarily always behave the nicest to his brothers. They seemed to get annoyed with him. Now, I remember with my siblings, there was times we got annoyed with each other. It was rarely because we were all being nice to each other. In fact, I don't know if that ever actually happened, to be honest with you. So I'm guessing Joseph probably wasn't exactly perfect. And you follow this story of Joseph through the ages, and it's interesting because you can also note, because as I back up a little bit here, not only do his brothers get annoyed with him with the dreams, at one point even his father says, all right, that's enough. Just quit talking about these things. You know, like, you really think I'm going to be bowing down to you? The brothers get annoyed. Now, can you imagine being Joseph? Can you imagine being this brother that shows up and you're you're probably like, oh, they're a little annoying, but you know what? It's still my family. He goes out to meet them, and they throw him in a pit. Get him shipped off to Egypt. I want to ask you this question. How do you think it is that Joseph was able to have the impact he did in what was probably the most powerful nation on earth at that time, had he not had an education experience that he had? He had to have been very well educated by his father, because he stood for some things that a lot of people would have not stood for. Now, going through the trials was also a big part of his educational experience, right? The experiences he had. Because you get locked in a prison for doing something you didn't do. And in that prison, you become the leader of the prisoners. That's amazing to me. And in doing so, I'm sure he spent time taking what he had learned and presenting that to other people. In fact, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Sight and Sound plays. I think they're down in like Pennsylvania. There's 2 or 3 places. I think Branson, Pennsylvania. I don't know what the term is. They do these plays, and they're these enormous plays on different biblical stories. And it's kind of interesting, the story of Joseph, in that, because you know, when you have a play or you have something that's depicted in that, people take an opportunity to kind of expand the story, to fill it out a little bit, right? And to expand this story, they decide to present the idea that Joseph, when he's in the prison, takes time to teach the prisoners how to read. And I really like that, because he's taking people who had no hope of anything, and he's giving them hope, but he's giving them hope by giving them literacy. I see several BC principles around here. If you have no literacy, no ability to read, what can you pull out of this Bible? Not very much. In fact, if you don't, you can only rely on what people tell you. What if what the people are telling you isn't true? I mean, any one of you has the opportunity to take the Bible, go back after I'm done speaking, and you can go pick through anything you want and go, wait a second, that stuff he said, that doesn't match with the way I would understand the Bible to be. I just thought that was a neat depiction of maybe Joseph doing something that gives people an ability, an opportunity to improve. And the Adventist Church has an education system that distinctively impacts that. Now what I think is where this all starts to come to a culmination. I mean, like I said, we could spend a lot of time looking at a lot of stuff, and I could keep flipping pages. But this one, you may think, some of you may have already gotten ahead of me on this, and you might be there already. To me, Exodus is where God's education system starts to come out in its fullest. And that's where our Seventh-day Adventist education system, I believe, also shines through. Our education is to be, like let's put it this way, when we're trying to figure out how we want to understand what education should look like, it's about God's character, who He is, and His salvation for us. So let's take a look as we spread Egypt out a little bit here, the story of Exodus and Egypt and what takes place there. First of all, at the beginning of Exodus, as you get to Exodus 7, like chapter 7, and you follow that through to chapter 13, we look at the plagues. Now, you can shout this out if you want this one, because I haven't done enough being like a teacher, I don't think. So if you want to shout it out, you can. There's plagues listed here. Where's the other place in the Bible where plagues are listed? Oh, good. I heard it. All right. We got good students. Okay. We have plagues that show up here and in Revelation. Had a really fun conversation as I was driving yesterday, coming in with, we have an 8-passenger van. So it has enough for my family and us 3 kids. We also have a little dog, but then we also had my sister-in-law and her 2 kids. So every seat was taken and there was a dog. And a lot of baggage. And we're all driving through, and we had a really interesting conversation as we're driving about these plagues. What do they all mean? What's this all about? The plagues in Revelation and these plagues. And I thought it was really interesting because the first thing to take note of that I did not know until about 2 years ago, because I spent time digging in and reading a little bit deeper, was of the 10 plagues, the first 3 affected everyone, including the Israelites. It's not until after that that there's a distinction made between the Egyptians and the Israelites. Now, if we take what I mentioned before, where Israel's like this example of Israel getting to the promised land, is kind of similar to us looking to get to the promised land. At the end of the journey, when we're going to be taken into that place, there's 7 plagues in Revelation. But there it mentions that all 7 only affect, in quotes, Egypt and Babylon, if you want to put it that way. And I think there's a reason why there aren't 3 other plagues listed. They're not necessary anymore. The education has been complete. When those last plagues fall, everybody's made their decision. But here at the beginning, back in Exodus, the Israelites don't fully know who God is. They don't understand his full power. They don't understand his full creativity. They don't understand anything about that because they've had all these years of being enslaved in Egypt. Now, in many cases, we've had many years of being enslaved in Egypt as well, because the slavery is a representation of being enslaved in sin, right? And so those first plagues start to show that there is a judgment coming and a decision needs to be made. And Israel is being given fair warning and fair understanding of what's going to happen with this, but those 3 help them understand that a little bit more. It helps to educate them. The remaining 7 are a continuation of education, in my opinion. Because as they continue to fall, you start to see that some of the people are there to help Pharaoh. You know, Pharaoh's sitting there and he's being as stubborn as can be, and all of a sudden some of his high officials are like, you know what, just this isn't worth it anymore. Like, let's stop this stupidity. We're putting ourselves in a situation that's just going to destroy the country. But the stubbornness of Pharaoh won't allow for that. It's interesting as well because in Exodus 12:38, you recognize that the education that has started to take place of Israel and of Egypt actually has an effect. Because it says that when they left, a mixed multitude went with them. That tells me, if I'm reading it correctly, that there were Egyptians who had seen these things happening and recognized the power and the sovereignty of God over a Pharaoh god and said, I'm going with them. And they walked out of Egypt with the Israelites. That's what that tells me. You know what else is also very interesting? And if you want to shout this one out, you can too. When was the first Passover celebrated? Before or after deliverance? It was before deliverance. Isn't that really neat? It wasn't like, okay, once God does this thing, we're going to go and sell. God's like, you go and you do this Passover thing. You can do it because you are, in other words, he's saying, I've saved you already, so go and celebrate Passover. And then they're delivered. I think that's kind of cool. So here we see God showing his sovereignty through an educational experience. It wasn't just telling people things, he's giving an experience. But he needs to explain more. As I've heard, I'm sure many of you have heard this before, it wasn't just about getting Israel out of Egypt. God needed to get Egypt out of Israel. I'm sure many of you have heard that before. That's not my quote. So don't say that I said that, and I don't know who said it, so I can't give the proper kudos, but it makes sense, right? And we get to the Ten Commandments. Now, back here we read through Deuteronomy, the section where he had given the commands and what he wanted us to do with them. And here are these commandments that he's sharing. It's interesting that with the commandments, it's the only part of the Bible that's written by God's finger. The rest is written by God's prophets, God's men, God's women, God's people. They've written parts, right? But this is written directly by God's hand. And he gives it directly to the people, right? Not only does he give the 10 Commandments on the tablet of stone, and we could go through the whole breaking those and remaking them and all that. He not only does that, but he shares them verbally with the people. That's why they cordoned off all of Mount Sinai and said, nobody's allowed to go past this barrier. I don't know if they were like those little barriers at Disneyland, and you're trying to keep your kid from running underneath, although kind of hoping that if they do, you could squeeze in line ahead of them and not wait so long. I don't know what they were like, but somehow there was this perimeter they couldn't cross because God was going to descend upon Israel and share his commands. He's teaching them a new behavior. And this is what's really interesting is no matter what happens, when God gives us something new, we're trying to figure out a process to deal with that. And I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to read John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. It's kind of a difficult book to read because it's in this really old language. But if you read through it, you see how Christian, the main character, goes through this process of becoming a follower, gets led off the path, goes all these different places, on and off the path, has these struggles as a Christian. But he arrives at an interesting place that when I heard it and picked up on it, I'm like, there it is. We all face it as Christians. He arrives at the mountain of legalism. And here God gives these commandments, and human nature is so easy to turn these into a legalistic must-do list. But God really wants to take these commandments and say, there's something different in how you can behave that's going to be impactful to those around you and to the relationships you have and to your relationship with me. And these commandments are sharing with you my character. I'm not saying it's not important to follow the commandments. Please don't go, that education director, he came out here and he said, don't follow the commandments because it's legal. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is God's saying, over here where you saw murder happen all the time in Egypt, I'm going to say thou shalt not murder because I'm a God of life. And over here where it says, honor your God. In Egypt, you saw all these gods that were kind of being honored, but not really. I want you to honor me because I created you and I've redeemed you. And he's showing all of these things so that they understand that. And it's actually so cool because it all culminates in that fourth commandment, which is the only commandment that is written differently between Exodus and Deuteronomy, which I'm sure you already all know. One says, honor the Sabbath day because on it I created the heavens and the earth. And the other one says, honor the Sabbath day because I have taken you out of Egypt. In other words, there are two things you need to keep in consideration when you're keeping the Sabbath. Are you recognizing that I created you and that I can sustain you? And are you recognizing that I redeemed you? If those are being honored in the process of your Sabbath, how you're working, what Sabbath looks like for you, you're doing what Sabbath is supposed to be. Right? And he had to lay out a few extra things about that because they didn't understand what it meant to not have your maidservant work or your self work, right? That was laid out to help them understand it, but it's really about, I did this for you because I love you. And then right after the commandments, we get to a really interesting piece. And that's the sanctuary. I love the sanctuary. It is just the most fascinating thing. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to walk through those life-size sanctuaries that they can set up. I know the U.S. used to have 2 or 3 semi-trucks that would go around, and they would set them up in like a school field, and then they would do tours. And I know they did one in Canada. We had it out at the Mansas conference when I was working there. It was really neat to just walk through and kind of imagine what it would have been like to walk through this sanctuary, but not only just to walk through it, but to realize that that thing lasted them like over 200 years. Or maybe 600, I can't remember them. Whatever the number is, it's way more time than any tent I've ever slept in. And that thing just kept going because God sustained it. But within it, we see the entirety of salvation worked out. See, at the beginning, so you have a sanctuary, right? It could be like this room right here. It's kind of a big rectangle like this, right? And over at that end, that's where the entrance to the sanctuary is. John 10 talks about the idea where Christ is the gate, and through him only you can enter. You can only enter through that gate. So we see Christ there represented in the gate. In John 1:29, we see that he's a sacrificial lamb who's placed on the altar. So you walk through the gate, you get to the altar. It could be like kind of somewhere over there. Then you see the bronze laver in 1 John 1:9 as one example, and there's many of them in there, where Christ, and talk about the Christ and the cleansing water. So that's all out in the courtyard. Then you walk into the sanctuary. John 6 talks about Christ as the bread of light. John 8 about Christ as the light of the world. Revelation 8 talks about how Christ is there in the sanctuary at the altar of incense, and the prayers are coming up, and they're mingled with Christ as they're coming up to God. Hebrews 10 talks about the veil and how Christ is that veil. He's there as the veil between us and an eternal perfect God who, if that veil was not there, we would be destroyed. And Romans 3 talks about the mercy seat. Isn't it interesting how even back that long ago, the whole process is at the mercy seat. It's called the mercy seat. It's not called the judgment seat. Now, I'm somebody who enjoys being outdoors. I've done lots of camping. I find it harder at this age to camp. I'd prefer to have like a nice big thick mattress and, I guess it just comes with age maybe. But outside, so if this rectangle here that we're all sitting in is the sanctuary, outside of that was where Israel was encamped. 3 camps over there, 3 camps over there, 3 camps over there, 3 camps over there, one for each of the tribes. Where are those camps placed? They're outside. And over here in this corner, in the most holy place, is the seat of God, the mercy seat. And within that, that's where Adam was. Adam and Eve were right there in the presence of God. And God is saying, through this process, he's educating Israel, which should be an education to us. That he's saying, I'm going to leave that seat. I'm going to walk all the way out here to the camp. And then I'm going to say, follow me. And if you've ever had a little child who's excited to see you come running up and hold your hand, that's what we would want. That's what I want to do. And he's going to bring us back through each of these processes that are laid out to bring us back into communion with him. This system was not set up as some grotesque example of what Christ was going to go through on the cross. It was not set up as some sort of a thing to just mimic what the pagans did so that we would look similar to them. And by the way, I don't know if anybody here has had the opportunity, and I wouldn't suggest it being a particularly pleasant one or one you should see. I had the opportunity to visit Nepal back in 1999 and do a mission trip with Adra there. And I witnessed them doing a sacrifice of a bull. I mean, I kind of witnessed it. Should I say I really witnessed it? Because it really wasn't something it is kind of out of the corner of my eye because I didn't want to watch it. It was happening over here. That was not God's intention, is to create something that looked like that. Or to mimic that so that we'd be similar. And it was not to show that this is how Christ is going to, some grotesque way to show this is where Christ is. The whole institution of the sanctuary was to educate Israel about God's intention to come to this world, take anybody who wants to be a part of him, and bring them back to communion with him forever. And if you don't want to believe that, read Revelation through the eyes of the sanctuary. Because first of all, it's the revelation, just in case you didn't know, it says the revelation of the Christ. It's not the revelation of the Antichrist. But if you read Revelation through the eyes of the sanctuary, it changes what Revelation looks like. And in fact, that very first man that is laid out, it says he turns and there's a man there and he has this face with a voice of thunders, and his legs are like bronze, if you take that and you were to lay that man down on the sanctuary with the head at the most holy place to the feet at the end, all of the colors match through the sanctuary. His legs were bronze, his feet were bronze, just like the laver and where the sacrifices took place. He has a lampstand of gold in his hand with 7 stars, just like the lampstand. And at the most holy place is the voices of thunder and a face with glowing eyes you couldn't even look at because of that power that God has. When you look at Revelation through that, you realize it's continuing to bring us back to this idea of everything's about Christ coming to earth to get us. He's educating us on that. So to wrap this up so that everybody can go get lunch. There's something kind of interesting to keep in mind. I will stand here, I will defend our education system until Jesus comes again. But because I see our education system doing exactly what Christ asked us to do, and that is present him as somebody who is coming, who did come, I guess, now we're in the post, came to earth to get us and bring us back to him. And we're a part of that work. That's why it matters to me, not because of all the things that could come out of it. I'm going to share a very, very brief story about my dad. I could share a lot of stories about him because I spent a lot of time with him. This one did not happen actually with him, but it ties into what I'm going to wrap this up with. So I told you I went rock climbing with my brother-in-law. And that's something I've always enjoyed doing. And when we would be climbing, you have harnesses on, so I'm going to step over here so that you can understand a little bit. You often have shoes on that are very, very sticky and grippy. Those help you to stick to the wall better. And you try to climb in these, it's not even fun. Try to climb in regular shoes, but you get rock climbing shoes, you feel like you're like, a mountain goat. And you have a harness on, and you have all these carabiners that clip in, and you lock them, and you tie in, and you do all this work. And you have to do something called lead climbing when you're doing multi-pitch. So I would stand at the first pitch, I'd be belaying my brother-in-law. And he'd climb up, and he'd clip into protection on the way up, so that if he fell, he'd only fall as far as wherever that last piece of protection was. But every time we were in a position together, before either of us did anything, we had several commands we would say to each other. On belay, belay on, climbing, climb on, things like that. But we'd also check each other's gear. I'd check, yeah, you're tied in right, everything's good. He'd check, yep, you're hooked in right, all your carabiners are locked. When my dad taught rock climbing, he always told the students, check, double check, triple check before you do anything. Why? Because human error is the first thing that gets in the way, and that's what causes accidents, right? Look at most plane crashes, it's usually human error. Look at most car crashes, it's usually human error. Same thing in rock climbing. So you check, you double check, you triple check. He had a student come to him who told him a story that he was out climbing with a buddy of his, and they were both there at the top of a ledge, a few hundred feet this direction, a few hundred feet that direction. I see some people like ready to pass out just hearing these types of stories. And he's standing there, and he hears my dad behind him. Just so you know, my dad wasn't really there, but he hears him behind him like he would have on a field trip going, "Did you check that?" He said, "Of course I checked it." "Did you double check that?" "Well, yeah, of course I double checked that." "Did you triple check that?" "All right, I'll check." And him and his buddy look down, and they look at how they're clipped in, and they realize, because you take a piece of webbing, so flat webbing, like similar to what you might tie something down on the back of a truck, only this is called tubular webbing, so it's flat, but if you were to kind of unfold it, you could stick your finger through this tube. And you tie that into a loop, and you clip that into yourselves as safety. And they look down, and they realized that loop, and maybe I could use this as an example. So there's your loop, and you'd clip in here, right? Now you got yourself something to hold you up, right? They had clipped in like this. If they had leaned off on that, there would have been nothing there. Did you check? Did you double check? Did you triple check? Here's why our system is so important. From Isaiah 30, verses 18 to 22. "Therefore, the Lord will wait, that he may be gracious to you." There's the world we're living in right now. He's still waiting, right? He hasn't come. He's being gracious to us. I hope he's waiting so that he's ensuring I'm going to be there, and that you're going to be there, and that your grandkids are going to be there, and your aunts and your uncle, and whoever he needs to wait for. "And therefore, he will be exalted, that he may have mercy on you." Notice how the exaltation of God comes as showing through his mercy. It's not about this arrogance of anything. It's about his mercy being shown, his character. "Blessed are all who wait for him. For the people shall dwell in Zion at Jerusalem. You shall weep no more. He will be gracious to you at the sound of your cry when he hears it. He will answer you. And though the Lord gives you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, your teachers will not be moved into the corner anymore." So anybody who's a teacher out there, anybody who's been supported by a teacher, anybody who's had a good teacher, they're not being moved into the corners. They're going to be heard. And listen to this. But your eyes shall see your teachers. Your ears shall hear the word behind you saying. Did you check? No, it's not going to say that. But similar, right? You shall hear the words behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. When you turn to the right hand or whenever you turn to the left, you will also defile the covering images of silver, the ornaments of the molded images of gold. You shall throw them away as unclean things, and you shall say to them, get away. The story I shared about my dad is a rock climbing story. But the teachers in our system, who are as imperfect as they are, and the principals in our system, who are as imperfect as they are, and the director of education at the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Canada, who is incredibly imperfect, maybe at some point, a young person is going to hear the voice behind them going, did you check? Did you double check? Did you triple check? Or that's the modern version. The version here is walk this way and go in it. That's the purpose of our system. That's why I defend it. That's why I work for it. Because one day we're going to get to heaven and all those teachers have done all that work. They're going to stand there and somebody's going to come to them and say, thank you. I'm here because I heard that thing you said to me back in Bible class in 1992. And when I heard it and I needed it, it was there. And I'm here because of that. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father, we are so grateful for your love. We're grateful for the rain. We know that BC needs it. We ask that it will be pushed over the Rockies to places like Jasper and Slocan Lake. But there's a more important rain that we're waiting for, the latter rain. And as we await that, we know that in order to receive it, we need to have been prepared. We thank you that we have our schools, we have our churches, and we have our homes that are part of the education of us in you coming. In Jesus' name, amen.